time for a fresh outlook. Hello to all of our viewers here in the U.S. and abroad, and we thank you for watching. I'm Toschi. As always, we're going to take a look at the top stories from around the world and get a fresh outlook from our expert panel of guests. This week will mark 25 years since the Tiananmen Square massacre. In China, it is still not permitted to speak publicly or to write about Tiananmen. And if you go onto the internet with any material with the date of June 4th, it is met instantly with the country's internet firewall. For many years, the democracy movement used May 35th as a way to bypass Chinese censors. However, that day is now also banned. Here's a look back at the massacre that is still making headlines 25 years later.
25 years after the bloody and deadly military crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in China's Tiananmen Square, a former student protest leader speaks out about her experiences, calling for all Chinese people to remember what happened and why it was so important.
I think all the Chinese people, particularly younger generation, should learn about it. They should be proud of that.
The government have their official up to here.
Amnesty International Secretary General Salil Shetty tours Hong Kong's first Tiananmen Museum ahead of the 25th anniversary of the 1989 crackdown in Beijing.
But actually there's been scores of arrests of people who are linked somehow to the Tiananmen Square crackdown. So, almost like settling scores, sort of drawing new red lines, sending a signal to the people that dissent is simply unacceptable.
Now, as the anniversary nears, China's new president, Xi Jinping, has shown no sign that his leadership will change its stance on the protests, which denounces them as a counter-revolutionary movement. His government has also sought to put pressure on activists who are calling for an official re-evaluation of the government crackdown. The Chinese government has yet to acknowledge the 1989 massacre. And in China, most mention of the anniversary has been censored from the internet.
To talk more about this, we are joined by my co-host and former White House aide Dee Dee Benkie, Dr. Stephen Bronner from Rutgers University, and via Skype is Tim Webster, professor of law and director of East Asian Legal Studies. Nice to see you again, Tim.
Hi, Mia. How are you?
And I promise I'm going to say Tim Webster, not Tim Sullivan, as I did last week. So. We want to start talking about this in terms of history. 25 years later, Dr. Bronner, you work with a lot of young students in your classrooms. How do you explain this to kids that hundreds of thousands of kids were gunned down?
Well, the way I would explain it is as the leading part of an international movement, because 1989, of course, was the year that the Berlin Wall fell. And there were thousands upon thousands of people in the street. At that time, President Gorbachev was in Berlin. People weren't sure whether they would send in the tanks or not. And this was, I think, a situation where different movements throughout the world were, or at least much of the world, were inspired by the Chinese movement. And that this is not something you can forget.
Well, absolutely. You can't forget something like this. Dee Dee, your eyes popped out right there.
Yeah, I don't know if I would use the word inspired, that the Chinese inspired people, because this was such a tragedy. And China's still got huge problems. How wonderful to live in a country that we live in, where we don't kill our own people, we don't censor people, we don't kill babies because they're little girls. I mean, look, this country, it was bad then and it's bad now about human rights and about how they treat their own people, and then they lie about it. They have revisionist history.
That's
so
true.
It's very bad across the board.
I was just going to say, they've sort of rewritten the history books right there. Tim, weighing in on this right now, why did the government declare martial law?
Sure. So earlier that year in April, one of China's leading reformer politicians, a guy named Hu Yaobang, had passed away, and students gathered to mourn his spirit, his life as well as his spirit in Tiananmen Square in April of that year. And people were concerned, students were concerned that with his death would also mean the death of the political reforms, the economic reforms, the other liberalizations that he had advocated. So from about April until obviously June 4th, when the tanks were ordered in, somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million students and trade union activists and others flooded, I should say, Tiananmen Square.
It's just amazing to think anything like that. I mean, we saw Occupy Wall Street on this very small scale.
Oh, it's very small scale.
But to sit there and think about kids being gunned down by the government, it is absolutely mind-boggling to think about that. Now, we see this now happening with Thailand as well. We're seeing something like that right now. Do you think that the Chinese martial law 25 years ago is anywhere remotely the same as Thailand's martial law today?
Martial law is a very extreme action, and once one sets that up, people are going to be killed. I said that with the inspiration because if you think to yourself, what's the one image of Tiananmen Square that still holds? It's that single person standing there in front of the tanks, and I often show that in classes, and this impresses the students, perhaps unduly so. Also, for the Arab Spring, Tiananmen Square came up all the time. And I think that's also legitimate, because this is a real fight for human rights and democracy.
Do you think that China today has rewritten the history books, Dee Dee?
Yeah, they've rewritten it because they're wrong. They know it, but they're still the same country. They're still doing the same terrible things to their own people that they were back in the 80s, that they were back in the 1780s. You look, I mean, China is consistent. They have no respect for their people. Human rights, forget democracy. It's a police state at all times. I mean, they have perpetual martial law, and it's very unfortunate. And students don't want to hear this. Young people, they want their liberty, they want their freedoms, and all Chinese do, but I think especially young people.
Absolutely. I think this is definitely for young people, but I've found it shocking to know that even today in modern China, June 4th is blocked from the internet. And how do you explain that to a young kid? Tim, your thoughts on that?
Sure. I have the surreal experience of actually educating young Chinese students who have finished their undergraduate degrees in China, coming to the United States and often telling them for the first time about the events of June 4th. So Dee Dee's right in the sense that this forced vacuum, or this complete erasure of June 4th from the Chinese popular discussions, from histories, from common knowledge is quite shocking. And what I find shocking is that students born in the early 90s and to the present have virtually no knowledge of this really seminal event in Chinese history. So I explain to them, often to their disbelief, that yes, also the idea of protest is not so strange in China right now. There are hundreds of protests throughout China every day, but the idea of hundreds of thousands of students congregating in Tiananmen Square, I think, certainly opens their eyes. And certainly when I mentioned the fact that the military then intervened and murdered between 2,000 and 3,000 students,
and a very good
is also quite shocking.
A very good point on that, Tim, because
as we discussed, that's not part of popular discourse.
And a very good point on that, Tim, because we really don't know how many students were really murdered. 2,000 to 3,000, that's a big discrepancy in how many people. Why do you think the Chinese, even today, are so worried about people knowing their past?
Because it's so bad. Because what they do
but
is
it's
so
their
terrible.
history, and all countries do.
But they're trying to hide it, though, and there's a reason for that. Because the international community, obviously, everyone looks down on that. Nobody thinks it's good to murder your own people, or really anyone.
Yeah. Well, this is the triumph of human rights.
Let me just say one thing about that, because I mean, China was ostracized from the international community after Tiananmen, but now they're very well connected. So it has flip-flopped a little bit there, and it does come down to why don't they explain their own history?
One of the reasons is usually democracy is seen as connected somehow with capitalism, or the introduction of capitalism. And here's a situation where it wasn't. And this is something that flips people out. The other thing is that the core of Chinese political ideology is that the Communist Party is all-knowing and infallible.
So much so that they have to block all the truth and information. They have to censor everything so they can brainwash people.
Well, that's exactly the word I would use.
Yeah,
brainwashing.
And national channels, so they hear about how great communism is and how they're almighty. Oh, but let's take away history, something that might change people's minds.
And this isn't new historically. I mean, this happened under Stalin. It happened in Romania. It happened in a lot of different places.
And we're seeing a lot of countries right now banning the internet, Facebook, and all sorts of other things. But it still is shocking to see that China is doing this right now, being the largest.
And they're so bold about it. I mean, it's like, what? Do you think we don't know now? I mean, because we know the international community, of course, for sure.
The issue for them, I think, that it's so difficult, is that on the one hand, they're opening up economically, so people are becoming aware of the West in a way they weren't before. And on the other hand, they want to impose this kind of censorship, top-down stuff.
Well, I think it's going to make it harder, too, more capitalism and more money, and economically.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
do better that way, and it's going to be very difficult for them to continue this archaic censorship of their people.
Yeah.
So they're going to have some struggle there, which is why they're going to block it as much as they possibly can, as long as they can. Tougher with social media, though.
Let's talk about a couple other items here in the international segment. Putin this week says he's going to back off of Ukraine.
Yeah, right. you know my views on this from the beginning. I said, forget it. Putin's moving forward. He has, and he'll continue to do so as long as possible.
What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Bronner?
It depends what you mean. If you mean straight-out intervention, military intervention, I don't think he would do that.
But they're already there.
But no, they're on the border.
He has troops there.
The Crimean situation is complicated because under Stalin, basically the entire area was repopulated by Russians. That's usually left out, and the tie between the two is real. In fact, I don't think though for Putin, it makes sense to, how should I say, to engage in the military intervention. I think and by the way, and I don't think the West is going to engage in military
Putin disagrees with you. I think Putin disagrees with you. I think he thinks it makes perfect sense. Go as far as he can.
Well, I think he's going to keep pushing the envelope because obviously with Obama in office, I don't think he has a great deal of respect for Obama.
Well, to me, what's interesting is that relationship soured because there was a the missile agreement was generally seen as acceptable and working. What's happened here is, if you look back historically, which you like to do, Dee Dee, Russia has always been very, very careful about moving outside of its sphere of influence. Inside its sphere of influence, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, then there's action.
I don't want to cut you off. We had the European elections also. We saw a very disinterested Europe. Any thoughts on that? You think the EU is in crisis right now?
When has the EU ever really worked? I mean, it seems sort of dysfunctional, and I'm not surprised that you have these state nationalists in France who are like, look, we want to do our own thing. This is not working for us. Things are not going well. I'm not surprised. I don't think the EU is, and look what they've done with Turkey. They won't let Turkey in. I mean, they've really been unfair, so they've got some real problems, the EU does. So I'm not surprised.
Tim, very quickly, we just want to get your final thoughts on this as well.
EU elections?
Yes.
Sure. Again, I like Dee Dee, I'm still not entirely clear what purpose EU elections serve. You have functioning governments at the nation-state level that handle and listen to and respond to the citizens' concerns in each of those countries. So I don't know to what extent EU elections are going to help change or respond to citizens' concerns in each of those individual countries.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for being on the show and talking to us. Don't go away, everyone. When we come back, we're going to talk about the shooting rampage that took the lives of 7 students at a California college this past week.